So we're going to get started. Thank you everyone so much for coming. I'd just like to very quickly introduce Aida Martinez-Gomez. Aida is a professor of legal translation and interpreting at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She has a PhD in translation and interpreting studies. A couple of us who were in the room saw Aida give a fantastic training with the New Sanctuary Coalition at this point several months back. And she's been gracious enough to work with us as well. She's been extremely generous with her time. She's met with a bunch of people in the room and within the organization more broadly to get a sense how we operate, what our needs are, and we've sort of worked to tailor these trainings just to her justice. So I'm going to turn it over to Aida. Let's just give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, everybody, so much. I am so thrilled to be here, and I have to say thank you to Madeline because she's been my point of contact and my sounding board as I was preparing these trainings. And thank you to all of you who met with me the last time I came, because meeting with you has helped me understand what your needs are and kind of figure out what was the best way to approach these trainings. We don't have a lot of time for all the things that I want to tell you, so I'm just going to jump right in. This is the plan for our training today. We're going to do a little brief introduction, because I know you all know each other, but I don't know you. So I want to know what each of you do and how you work with interpreters. And then I'm going to talk about how you can make your conversations through interpreters more effectively at 3 different stages: before the interpreting happens, during the interpretation, and after. And then we'll have some time to discuss other challenges and opportunities that I didn't foresee in my training, and then we'll wrap up. So hopefully we'll keep it under an hour. So let's just dive in. You were mentioning that you've worked with in-person interpreters and telephone interpreters in a wide range of situations. And I wanted us to start by reflecting on who the interpreters that we work with are. They fall into any place in a large continuum in at least these 4, which I think more core features that are relevant for how we address our interactions with them. In terms of training, you have to know, if you don't know already, that in the US, very few people have advanced training in translation and interpreting. Translation and interpreting education programs, formal programs, are something that's relatively new. And there are a lot of short workshops and crash courses and 20-hour, 30-hour, 40-hour courses, but there are very few fully fledged programs at the college level or the graduate level. So if we are working with untrained interpreters, they not only don't know what the best practices are, but they do not have learned the skills that interpreting requires, that take years to develop. So, and as I'll say at the end of this slide, we need to provide them with as much support as we can so that they can do the best they can given their limited background, training, or education. But given the state of the profession, even though academic programs are not new, there's a wide range of experiences because many people are self-taught. So sometimes we work with interpreters that even though they have not received proper formal training, they have 20, 30 years of experience, and they will have learned what they need to know, mostly by trial and error, oftentimes. But sometimes we all do, develop kind of habits that are not the best in certain situations, and everybody does in their own professions. So even when working with experienced interpreters, we need to provide them with support so that we all achieve the goals of our interaction. And experience tends to be important when talking about phone interpreters, and as we discussed when I was here last time, because you need to have experience in telephone phone interpreting, because phone interpreting requires a certain set of skills. The technical problems, the audibility, the turn-taking management is much more difficult, and they need to have certain skills that would allow them to handle those challenges more successfully. Obviously, the more familiar an interpreter is with her justice and its mission and its goals and the work that you guys do, the better work she will do. And also, we have different experiences with the familiarity with the client. Sometimes that the interpreter is familiar with the client can be a good thing, because they have this relationship of trust with the client. If the client brings in somebody from their family or the community, they have a sense of trust, they feel more comfortable, they're accustomed to their accent or their dialect, and they have background about the case that it's going to help them be more successful interpreting. It also provides challenges, because that case background may make them sometimes be a little bit more proactive in terms of advocating or responding on behalf of the client and things like that. And those things may or may not be welcome, and we're going to learn a few tools kind of to make the best out of those benefits and kind of contain the challenges. But as I said, it's for our own benefit to support all of them as much as we can, but the further left they fall in the spectrum, the more support they're going to need from us. So here's how we support them. The first thing that we need to understand is that interpreting starts before interpreting starts. So before we even, the moment we sit down with the interpreter and the client, or the moment we pick up the phone to call the phone interpreting, it's very important to devote 5 minutes, or sometimes even shorter, to do what we call the briefing. Usually briefings can be, a good part of the briefing does not require the client to be there. And ideally we would want to conduct the briefing only along with the interpreter, but that is usually not common in the way that situations of interpreting happen. And it's okay to conduct the briefing with the client present. So what I'm going to talk about is assuming that the client is present. And you are going to be the professional, let's talk about it, quote unquote, the professional in the room. You're responsible for the interaction. You are going to be the one who's going to be the most proactive one in setting what the rules of the interaction are going to be. The most important thing in that sense is that you make a point to include everybody present. So even if during the briefing you're communicating certain things to the interpreter that only the interpreter needs to know, please make sure that then the interpreter is relaying that to the client so that the client doesn't feel left alone or doesn't know what's happening. And this is something that's going to keep coming up. This is a three-way conversation. Nobody should feel left aside at any point, even if it's just by the interpreter saying, whoever Madeline is telling me what is expected of me as an interpreter during this meeting. We don't have to relay the whole thing, but just tell them what's happening. So this is what I think the ideal structure of the greeting should have. And we're going to break those 5 points down one by one. The first one is provide a space for introductions. This allows you to see whether the interpreter and the client speak the same language, speak the same dialect, they understand each other. If it's over the phone, verify the call quality. And also to figure out if for some reason the client is not comfortable with that particular interpreter. Sometimes there are gender issues, sometimes there are ethnic background issues, interpreting at one point with a Moroccan colleague, and a client was Berber, and she did not want the Moroccan interpreter, even though they spoke the same dialect. There was an ethnic conflict in there. She didn't trust that interpreter, and we had her replaced.
Can I ask a question? How would you ask the question of the client? If everybody's in the same conversation, how do you check that level of comfort?
That is a tricky question indeed. Right, because you need to ask the client through the interpreter. I don't have a good answer for that.
You just have to go through the interpreter.
You have to, I mean, at that point, you don't have any other option. You should be, because, and the problem is, some people would not feel comfortable saying to somebody's face, I really am not comfortable with you.
How did you know in your conversation with your colleague? How did you know?
The client was adamant. She refused to talk.
Oh, she refused to talk.
The client refused to talk to that interpreter.
And did she say, I don't want to talk because X, Y, Z, or you guys inferred that?
As far as I knew, because I wasn't present, because it was not my pair of working languages, but the professional had a little bit of background and kind of teased that out of her. She did, this was way back in Spain, so she teased out of her in Spanish that she didn't want, she said, yo verbe, and it's like,
Yeah.
kind of, they understood that she didn't want to have that interpreter, they preferred an interpreter from her own ethnic group. But yes, I can't think of any other way. If you had somebody else that we may be able to think about maybe creating a multilingual kind of flyer that just says, do you think you would be comfortable with this interpreter? Yes, no. And they would just show and read. Not everybody has reading competence, but they could just point without having to go through the interpreter. That is the only option that I can think of that would not require asking through the interpreter, do you feel comfortable?
Like, so for example, if we were in person with someone and we were calling an interpreter to communicate with the person who's present there, we could just show them a piece of paper that says, are you comfortable with this interpreter in their language?
Right.
That seems like a good solution.
And then over the phone, the interpreter doesn't even need to realize that you're showing a piece of paper to the client. Because one of the things that you also mentioned is that sometimes when you talk with you deal with phone interpreters, when they're very a small language communities, you fear that they're going to know each other and the client is not going to want to talk because then she would feel that the interpreter is going to know and then her community is going to know about this issue. That would be a way to approach it without having to involve the phone interpreter at that moment, having like a chart that would help them point yes or no. And I'll see if I can think of somebody else. That was a really good question. Then explain to them the purpose of the briefing. That you're going to take a couple of minutes to explain to them both why you're here and what we all can do to make this communication successful for all of us. And during that process, as I said, make sure nobody, and that nobody is usually the client, is not left out, and ask the interpreter to relay that information. And I also know that when you work with phone interpreters, you should record their ID number and also their telephone number in case the line goes down. Then the second point is to reaffirm confidentiality. And any interpreter that you work with should know this. If you're using your in-house interpreters, they would know. The over-the-phone interpreters would know. It may be useful to remind family members that accompany the client to insist on that confidentiality. But the reaffirmation of confidentiality I see mostly as useful for the client. It's a reassurance for her that whatever she says stays between the three of us. And then the third thing is to provide background to the interpreter about what the case is about, what your goals for the meeting are, and if there are any specific features that are important, that it is a domestic violence case and it's a sensitive case and you need to be very careful about how you phrase certain phrases and how you choose your words. All of this is going to allow the interpreter to activate her knowledge and skills to be able to be the most effective she can be. It will provide her with an awareness of how to respond to different challenges that come up, and it will set a tone for the rest of the conversation. If you warn her in advance, this is a very sensitive matter. The client knows, you know, but the interpreter may or may not know. This is a very sensitive matter, kind of puts her on alert. And I use interpreter as she almost all the time because, as it happens in this room too, interpreters tend to be mostly women too.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
In general, do the interpreters sign a confidentiality agreement with their agency? If it's a professional one?
It depends on the agency. So, professional codes of ethics for interpreters, all of them include confidentiality. And even if we do not sign a confidentiality agreement with our clients or the agency we work with, we are bound by those codes of ethics. It would depend on the company they work for if they have to sign anything or
With
not.
my experience, the violence interpreters have always said, just a reminder, everything that we say is confidential, blah, 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 and then they give you their number, their interpreter number.
Nice.
That's good, yes.
When we use Voyance, there's a moment when your client's on hold and you have the interpreter, but you haven't merged the calls yet. Do you suggest doing this briefing then, or really having it in front of the client and the interpreter? Like, I don't know if that's better to be efficient, or if really everyone should be on the same page.
What I would say is certain parts of the briefing can be done without the client. So the background to the interpreter can be done without the client. And what I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides about the instructions, quote unquote, for the interpreter can be done without the client. But the introduction should include the client, the confidentiality should include the client. And a few of the norms and instructions that I'm going to talk about should also include the client because she also needs to know how she needs to talk to help the interpreter. So this is what I call communication rules. And I didn't want to put rules, but I couldn't find a better word for it. And means what you need to discuss in this briefing to make the communication smooth. First of all, if you are in a physical space, if you're not over the phone, but the three of you are in the same room, it is usually recommended that you sit in a triangle so that everybody can maintain eye contact with everybody and it doesn't seem like you and the interpreter are there on that side of the room and I'm the client and I'm on this side of the room and it feels like it's two against one rather than it's a team effort. It's mostly a perception issue and the possibility of maintaining eye contact. But I know that in other situations and other scholars of interpreting do not prefer this triangle arrangement. They prefer the interpreter kind of to be sitting behind one of the parties and kind of unseen. I don't think that's very realistic, so I would rather stick to the triangle. And remind them, and this is especially important for the phone interpreters, of the turn taking. I talk, the interpreter interprets, then the client talks, then the interpreter interprets, then I talk again. Because sometimes you were telling me that the interpreters tend to jump in to interpreting simultaneously at the same time, and that confuses the client. And probably they do it because it's easier for them, if they have been trained, it's easier for them not to miss anything, and then they wouldn't have to interrupt if they're just speaking at the same time, interpreting at the same time. But if that's gonna be confusing for the client, and it's gonna make her not understand well and not be able to express herself as best as she can, then just tell everybody to respect each other's terms. And here are the instructions. And there are instructions for us, and there are instructions for the interpreters. So with the client present, we need to remind them, and in the presence of the interpreter, to say, we both, client and her justice staff member, we need to talk to each other. We need to talk slowly and clearly, and in short-ish sentences. Provide pauses for the interpreter after a couple of sentences. The more experienced, the more trained the interpreter is, the longer she can take listening and taking notes and then reproducing without losing any information. The less experience, less training she has, the shorter our sentences need to be. And you will be able to kind of assess that as you go. If you feel that she is comfortable, then you can start making your sentences longer or ask the client to go on a little more. And then encourage the client to ask the interpreter if anything is unclear. And that is something that I'm also telling the interpreters later. You need to try to make sure that the client is comfortable asking for clarifications, for repetitions, whatever she needs. And again, keep everybody included at all times. Tell the client, I am not going to engage with any one-on-one conversation with the interpreter without letting you know what we're discussing, and I would ask you to do the same. If you happen, and I'll get back to that later. And then instructions for the interpreter. The interpreter would need to aim to transfer what we both say as completely and as accurately as possible. They shouldn't be adding, they shouldn't be omitting, summarizing, and most importantly, remind them they should not guess. And guess sometimes is in terms of a word that they don't understand, a legal term, or when dealing with Spanish-speaking varieties, words that would not make sense for me in this context, but this word means what I think it means, but because in a different variety of Spanish, and that happens with other languages too, but with Spanish, which many of you work with, it's very clear. This doesn't make sense, what do you mean by so-and-so? And then encourage the interpreter also, if you're unsure about anything, just ask us, including legal concepts, for example. It's important to remind them to maintain the word choice. As we were saying, sometimes delicate topics require delicate phrasings and word choice. So the if we call the attention of the interpreter to that at the beginning, we may be able to avoid potential challenges in that sense later on. Same as us, we were able to ask for clarifications or repetitions, so does the interpreter. And the interpreter also can ask us to pause. If the interpreter sees that we're speaking for too long, she should be able to tell us, hold on a second, I need to interpret this, otherwise I'm going to forget. And again, keep everyone included at all times. The interpreter should also know that nobody is allowed to have side conversations, and be aware of the sensitive nature of the conversation. What can be very useful at this point is if you're in person, agree with the interpreter on a signal that she can give you or the client when she needs you to pause. And it can be like a tap on the shoulder or lifting her hand or something that it's agreed upon, and anytime we all see this, then we'll stop and let her interpret. That can be very useful. And then, who sets these rules? Because some of them can feel a little, we don't want the interpreter to feel like we are too harsh on her. We are assuming that she can do a good job. So I feel like the briefing is teamwork between you guys and the interpreter. The more inexperienced and untrained the interpreter is, the more she's going to need your guidance, because she doesn't know what she doesn't know. And she doesn't know what she needs. She doesn't know how long is too long for her to be able to, how long is too long that you speak for her to be able to retain everything and translate everything. But you do know what she needs, because I'm telling you. So the more untrained and inexperienced the interpreter is, the more you're going to have a proactive role in this briefing. The more trained and experienced, what I would recommend is, after the introductions and the confidentiality and the briefing about the case, tell her, what do you need us to know to make this communication successful and to help you do the interpretation? Have her take the lead in telling you, because then she will tell you, speak in short sentences, blah, 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 and then you're able to add anything that she did not cover.
Okay, so if it's a language that is completely strange to our knowledge, we have no idea if that person is trained or untrained, how are we gonna identify that? If we have no knowledge of the languages, like a Caucasian.
Right, I mean, you can know how much trained or untrained. You would assume a little bit of training if they're working for an agency or a phone interpreting company. That's not always the case, but you can assume some of that. If it's the client's sister, you can assume to a certain extent that she would mostly be untrained. But in case of doubt, I would go for, tell us what you need from us, and provide her with the space to give us, you and the three of you, as many instructions as she thinks necessary, and then you chime in. And as I said, either you should feel free to add, and then provide a space for the interpreter to voice her needs, because sometimes interpreters will tell you, is it okay if I have pen and paper to take notes? Or can I have a glass of water? Or is it okay if I have my phone here so that I can look up a word? Or I may be looking up words on my phone, don't think that I'm texting. So provide her with that little space so that she can add any further information. And then finally, ask them if they have any questions. And this, some of you, when I visited here, said, how do we deal with avoiding, how can we try to avoid that the interpreter gets defensive at some point when we tell, well, you're not saying what she is saying, or something like that. If you tell them at the briefing, before they've made any mistake, quote unquote, to your eyes, if you tell them from the beginning that you're going to enforce these rules, if you see that somebody's taking, like if the client is talking for too long, you're going to stop her. If you feel like the interpreter is summarizing, you're going to stop the communication. To go back to these agreed upon rules, then it feels like you're telling them in advance that you're doing this for the benefit of the communication. And also you should encourage them to say, something if they feel like you're breaking the rules. Because maybe you are speaking for too long and really long chunks of time. So you'll take the lead at stopping the communication and enforcing the rules, but if they see that you're the one breaking them, they should feel free to do so too. So we haven't even started interpreting. And this felt really long, but the reality is it takes less than 5 minutes. And it puts the interpreter on your side, because you're taking care of her and you're trying to provide an environment where she can be doing her job the most, in the best way she can. So that will ease up a little bit of potential conflicts that may up later. So during the interpretation, how can you help while interpretation is happening? First of all, you need to be aware, and probably you do this already, of what's the education level of your client? How much jargon can you use? Try to avoid overcomplicated jargon or acronyms, and also ask one question or make one point at a time. That would allow the interpreter not to have to be thinking of making these adjustments, but just conveying the message that you said in the way that you said it. For inexperienced interpreters in particular, it may be very useful if you help them manage the turn taking, because they, as I said earlier, may not know how long is too long for them to be able to take notes about or memorize before they start forgetting. So if you see that a client is talking for too long and you assess in that moment that it is okay and it's more beneficial to stop her, sometimes it's not possible. She's crying, she's emotional. It took her a long time to open up, and now she finally opened up, and you don't want to stop her, then that's fine. I'm going to train the interpreters in the next hour about how to deal with those moments where it's not a good idea to stop the client. But if you feel that it would be beneficial for the whole communication to stop the client, then you take that action proactively so that the interpreter doesn't have to. And also try not to interrupt or not to overlap talks. Sometimes the client says something and we understood and we really want to kind of reply to her immediately, and then there's a little overlap, and that is not very useful for the interpreter or for the client either, because she's going to have a hard time understanding. You are the person who has to be responsible for cultural or interpersonal issues. Try to foresee potential cultural differences or deal with the personality of the client. For example, if the client is feeling very emotional and is crying, the interpreter shouldn't be the one trying to comfort her in that sense. Some would. It also depends on the person, but it would be much more productive if you're that person, also because you probably have the training for that and the interpreter doesn't, or the experience. And then to the extent possible, try to monitor how much the client is understanding. Besides encouraging them to ask questions, we know that some people, because they're shyer or they come from cultures where it feels rude to say that you don't understand, try to encourage them to do so regardless, ask for repetitions, ask for clarifications, but also have other tools at hand. Try to read their body language, again, aware of cultural and personal differences. Sometimes people are just shy and they won't look you in the eye, and that doesn't necessarily mean one thing or another. But one thing that I found very useful, and some of you have told me that you already do, is double check whether the client understands. So ask her to repeat back to you X, Y, or Z, especially if after your meeting she has to go do something, file paperwork, fill out a form, have her tell you, okay, so what's your homework? And then she has to tell you, and that way you can verify whether the interpreter said everything and she understood everything, or if there's any gap there that happened. And finally, I encourage you to trust your interpreter. Sometimes people feel like because my sentence it's shorter than what the client said, I'm omitting things, but sometimes not necessarily. Or sometimes you hear a yes, and the interpreter translates that as a no. But that's not necessarily bad because of how the question, this happened to me a couple of days in class. We were doing an activity, and in English they said, is that all? No, wait, what was it said? No, anything else? No. And one of my students said, ¿algo más? Wait, ¿eso es todo? Sí. So, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, the original was anything else, no, but the translation was, is that all? Yes. And that meant the same thing, but you hear the client say yes, and the interpreter say no, and you're like, damn, she's making a mistake, right? So trust the interpreter, because sometimes sometimes we know what we're doing. And sometimes, if you feel like they're summarizing or filtering, it may not be on purpose. Most likely, it's not on purpose. Sometimes they just don't know how to do it better. That's why if you feel like they're summarizing, that means that your sentences or your utterances are too long. Try to make them shorter. It's just because maybe she can't retain that much information. But obviously, it happens, and these are the difficulties that you said you encounter. What do we do when somebody's summarizing or we feel they're filtering information? As I said, first, be proactive. Use short sentences and encourage the client to do so too. But then, if it still happens nonetheless, then be reactive. Ask follow-up questions. Can you elaborate on that? Not the interpreter, but if the interpreter gives you a very short answer, you feel like the client said something longer, then ask that, can you elaborate on that? The interpreter will have to relate, can you elaborate on that? And then you'll have a second chance at hearing what the client wants to say. Or ask the same question again a little bit later. Oh, I don't remember exactly what you said when I asked you so and so. Can you please repeat that? Or do you mind if I ask you again about that? Also, some research has shown that filtering is not always negative. If you're working with an experienced interpreter that is really aware of the goals of your institution, sometimes that filtering is useful, especially if you're pressed for time. And this research has come up with interpreters in medical settings, what they call dual role interpreters. There are nurse and medical professionals that are also acting as interpreters, interpreted for another medical professional, and sometimes the filtering is useful when you have like 5 minutes to see a patient and the interpreter kind of gives you the teased out information that you would need to make a diagnosis. That may not be applicable in your setting, but in other settings and in other situations, and if you're working with your in-house interpreters, your colleagues, their filtering of information is probably very well informed. And then if somebody's having a side conversation, again, there you stop and you remind them to include the other person. It can be the interpreter talking to you or the interpreter talking to the client. Just make sure that they include everybody. And the interpreters will appreciate the briefing opportunity because that shows that you're there to support them. So the defensiveness will go down a notch, I'm assuming. But if you still feel that the interpreter kind of gets defensive, if you need to stop the conversation and go back to the rules, I would advise that you be as little confrontational as possible. Don't say, she didn't say that. It's hard for me to say this because there's a camera right there, but try to play silly. And rather than blaming it on the interpreter that she did something that you don't agree with, try to turn it in a way that you didn't understand, or it was on you, so that she doesn't feel threatened. Usually the more inexperienced, when you deal with inexperienced or untrained interpreters, you have two extremes. People that are very humble and really want to do a good job and they're very aware of their limitations, sometimes too much, because they do a better job than they think that they're doing. And then you get some people who think that they do an amazing job because they've always been doing this and nobody has ever told them they did a bad job. So you need to find out how to approach each of them based on what you see the interaction evolving. And then, for these issues, use the wrap-up at the end of the session, which is what I'm going to talk about. Same as we had a briefing, it's very useful to have a debriefing, and sometimes it's not always possible. The debriefing is an opportunity for the interpreter and you to create a space for a mutual learning process, to make these interactions more useful in the future. That can be extremely useful when you work with your in-house interpreters. It may not be as useful when you work with a phone interpreter because the likelihood of you getting that same person in the future is lower. But at least you would be helping that interpreter to get better for the next interaction, whether it's with you or not. The first thing I would recommend is seek feedback from the interpreter, how she felt the interaction went, how your management of the interaction went, and what things she felt were useful for her, and what things that you did she feels that could have been improved to help her interpret better. And ask her if she has any questions about the procedure, because sometimes you're dealing with complex legal procedures that she may not be familiar with. And it would be a good thing for her to understand how an immigration process goes, or divorce, or whatever the case you may be dealing with. And then take that opportunity to provide the interpreter with feedback. Compliment her on the things that she did well. And ask her questions about why she did certain things, because sometimes you may pick up on something that you think is poor practice, but she had a very valid reason from her point of view of things why she did that. At some point you may feel like the interpreter is taking over the management of the conversation, and then you ask her about it and she said, well, I thought you were losing control of the discussion, that's why I took over. And that provides a space for you to discuss what your different perceptions were and how you can address these issues better in the future, and make suggestions for future meetings. Other issues that can be useful is, besides asking the interpreter for any other comments that she has, if the situation was complex and sensitive in nature, this has an impact on the interpreter's well-being, and I'm going to talk about that with interpreters later. Emotional situations take a toll on you, take a toll on the interpreters too. So having a moment there to kind of debrief with her how she's feeling and how she felt during the conversation and was she uncomfortable, how she's feeling now. And even ask her, do you have any plans tonight what are you going to do tonight to make you feel a little better? Are you going to have a glass of wine or take a bath, or I don't know, whatever. One thing that is very important, do not ask the interpreter about her opinion on the client or on the information that the client communicated. Don't ask the interpreter, do you think that the client is lying? You put her in a very awkward position, and I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, do you think that the client is lying? Puts the interpreter in a really awkward position. It's not her expertise, and her codes of conduct prevent her from answering those questions. So it's like a 3 strikes type of thing. And then, how do we do these briefings? Obviously without the client. Here the client is not needed. Ideally in a confidential area, and ideally immediately after the encounter, so that it's fresh in both of your minds. And it's ideally you would have a list of discussion points that can be very detailed, or can be as broad as asking what went well, what do you think needs improvement. And then what's very important is to let the interpreter speak first, and listen first, and then you can speak. And in your feedback, try to be explicit. I really like how you asked me for clarification about what alimony means. And I like very much how you told the client that you were asking me for a clarification so that she didn't feel excluded. Because that reinforces that good practice. But also be honest with your feedback. Don't tell somebody that they've done a great job when they haven't. which is a struggle sometimes because they're there and they're doing their best. But try to be positive and also constructive. If something didn't go well, then just tell them, I don't think this went well. Try to encourage them in the sense that they have the potential to make that better. Make a suggestion of how you think they would do better. If you felt like, for example, they were struggling with the terminology, maybe suggest, oh, when Aida came to her justice, she gave us a list of glossaries that maybe you would want to look at, which I do and I have to give to your team of interpreters. So do not point out problems, but also point out solutions. And that's it. And this was longer than I thought. I wanted you to kind of talk in little groups, but I think we're going to just do Q&A really. And then my final thoughts, and then we can just have a few minutes for Q&A. In summary, always brief, support during the interpretation, and debrief. That's the basic takeaway from this meeting. And adjust your degree of involvement depending on the degree of experience and training that the interpreter has. You may need to be more proactive with less training, less experience. You may be able to kind of sit back and relax a little bit more until it's very experienced. And then promote that feeling of a team. Support and trust your interpreter. You're a team. You're here for the benefit of the client. You're working towards the same goal. You're on the same boat. What can we do to make this collaboration work the best we can for all of us? Ta-da! That's it. There's a few questions, Susanna.
So thank you so much, this is so useful. One thing that I would struggle with when I am at the Family Justice Center and there's a client in my office and an interpreter on the phone is that sometimes I'm doing things physically that the interpreter can't see but the client sees. And I know like the client will say something, the interpreter will say something, and then there's silence because I'm taking notes. Or I'm handing the client paper in their language, or like I'm trying to like do something paperwork and the interpreter can't see. So am I narrating for the interpreter what's going on during all of that?
I would recommend so. I would also recommend that you include that in the briefing. At the briefing at the beginning, tell the interpreter, in this conversation, I may have to take notes and deal with some paperwork, so don't get worried if there's a silence, because probably I'm looking through my notes, writing notes, or handing some paperwork to the client. But as it happens, just remind them.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else? Is that all? That's it? Any questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. So Madeline helped me putting together these wonderful summary flyers that you can have in front of you when you're working with an interpreter. They're kind of very small summary of what we discussed here today. So hopefully that's helpful. You have the 5 stages of the briefing in the front and then the instructions in the back. And Madeline has my contact information, but I have a few cards here if you want to save them, and have my email in case you need anything.
Or should we just keep that for everybody?
Yeah. I'll just leave them here.
Thank you. Do not keep those back.
No, I was like, yeah.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Sorry. Also, I don't do it.
I
But I'm just wondering, a lot of times at Her Justice, we, like legal assistants in particular, or like I know PPC sometimes, serve as the interpreter for a client in which we work both the interpreter and legal assistant. And so a lot of times I've experienced the attorney telling me things as a legal assistant, not as the interpreter. And so if that's something that's better to talk about in the next session, that's fine as well. But I just, in terms of like working with an interpreter, I always struggle with like, okay, do I tell the client, the attorney just told me we need to prep a G639, a G28, a this, and this? Or do I like just say that, okay, this is my role as a legal assistant, and like, I'm not gonna like interpret that for the client? Does that make sense?
Yes. What I would recommend is tell the client.
Okay.
Don't tell the client in detail.
Right.
Tell the client, the attorney is telling me to fill out certain forms.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay, just to explain, like narrate.
Just not, for her not to feel excluded and not know what happens. Imagine that you are in a situation where you're asking for help and you don't understand anything that's happening. If two people are having a conversation among themselves, leaving you out, that would make me feel really anxious. So,
Especially when it's like your case.
right, so just tell her, she's telling me which forms I need to fill out when we finish this conversation. And I'm making notes of that, and that's it. These narrations don't need to be more than 7 words.
But it's better than just not telling someone.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you can foresee that that may happen, include it in the briefing too. Tell the client, at some point, the lawyer and I are gonna have short communications dealing with which paperwork we need to fill out for you. Don't worry, this is the way we do things. We'll let you know when that happens, but this will allow us to prepare your case the best we can. And I would assume if that were me, that would make me feel much more relaxed and confident that I have 2 people on my corner dealing with my case. All right. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you all. Again, if you have any questions, reach out to me